hundreds in Times Square gathered to honor the life of Michelle Go. She was waiting on a subway platform when she was pushed in front of a train. It's just the latest attack in the string of subway violence in the Big Apple, and now the new mayor is facing renewed calls to do something about the city's rising crime. Joining now to weigh in, representing Florida's 1st Congressional District, Congressman Matt Gaetz. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me. Congressman, there's a crime surge. We have some Democrats that are pretending that it's not happening. We have others that are trying to blame Republicans for the surge in crime, as if Republicans have been the party that have been demonizing law enforcement for years, which is obviously not true. But something needs to be done. I mean, this is such an outrage, and just these horrific crimes just happened in the past couple of weeks, and these are just a few of them. I mean, there's so many, we can't cover them all in one show.
Well, Democrats have socially distanced themselves from reality on the issue of crime in many cases. And this is what happens when you allow the prison gates to be open, when you allow the border to be open. And there's no doubt that in Democrat-run cities, our fellow Americans are poorer, less hopeful, and frequently that is because they are less safe. Now, you mentioned the mayor of New York, and he said that crime isn't really a problem in New York. It's the perception of crime that's the problem. But it wasn't perception that pushed Mrs. Guo before a moving subway train. It wasn't perception that causes people to live in fear in New York City. And so I think that you will see crime as a rising issue among voters in the midterms, particularly in urban and suburban districts. And we can contrast the policy options Democrats have put forward to demonize law enforcement, to make it harder for police to engage in active policing versus Republicans, who I think continue to stand right alongside our law enforcement and against these folks who terrorize our fellow citizens.
Yeah, it was truly disappointing to hear the new mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, suggest that there is no issue at the subway. It's just like in people's minds, just because like one person was thrown in front of the train tracks, that you know, we shouldn't think that that's going on widespread there. But if you actually look at the numbers and the statistics, it's gotten a lot more dangerous. And the fact that he has a law enforcement background and he said he was going to be tough on crime, and then this comes out of his mouth, I think that it's just so disconnected.
It's dehumanizing to the victims of crime to act as though their conditions and circumstances somehow are less meaningful because they don't conform with the left's narrative that we've just got to sort of pretend that crime doesn't exist, that we have to live in this alternate state of denial. Those policy choices are not just amplified in Washington, D.C., but in our states and in our local communities all across the country. We famously heard Barack Obama say elections have consequences. Well, the consequences for far too many are dire. And when we look at the needs of human beings generally, the need to be safe in your own community, in your home, going to make a purchase in your local economy, that's critically important to the American experience and to the American way of life.
And then aside from that type of crime, that this horrific violence that we've seen with these monsters coming out, going after, in this case, women, there's been a lot of theft, the smash and grabs, and again, people are trying to downplay it. It's like, oh, well, the stores have insurance, it's not a big deal, don't worry about it. But it's a big deal, and it's happening a lot, and it's very organized, and it's traumatizing for those who work in the stores, it's traumatizing for people in the community, and it's so disruptive. And I'm sure you recall Lori Lightfoot suggesting it was the business owner's fault, that they need to have their own security and that they need to maybe not put nice things in the window. I mean, it's just so absurd.
Well, and this really punishes middle-class folks and regular shopkeepers most. You know, it is true that the big Fortune 100 companies probably don't feel a massive hit as a result of smash and grabs, but if you're a small bodega, if you're a family-owned business, that really does impact not just the bottom line, but the perception that your customers have about how safe and secure and welcome they are in your establishment. And so this is yet another step that the Biden regime has taken to make life harder for regular folks that are trying to buy and build a business and attract customers, because they have amplified this narrative that, well, you know, these are victimless crimes. And gosh, if there are people who are engaging in smash and grabs, well, maybe they're mentally ill and maybe we need to provide them more services rather than providing consequence. It's not an accident that these events are rising in frequency in our country. It is a direct result of the policy choices that have been made, because now the word's out that if you commit one of these crimes, you're probably going to be treated less harshly than people who may have committed an act of trespass on January 6th at the United States Capitol, who are being locked up, deprived of access to counsel, and beaten and tortured.
And you think of who this hurts the most. Middle class and people that are better off, they're going to pick up and move to safer communities. We often see a lot of these Democrats from cities that have a lot of crime. For example, Marilyn Mosby, we were talking about her yesterday and her scandals in Baltimore. Well, it turns out she was trying to buy houses in Florida. And we see where AOC chooses to do vacation when she has free time. She heads down to Florida, doesn't wear a mask. I mean, these people want to go where it's safe.
Undeniably, and you're right, it's women, it's people who are in the middle class who are most likely to be victimized by this type of violence. And you're right that rich people are always going to be safe. Rich people are going to find a way to have the walls like Nancy Pelosi has around her community. But folks who pay their taxes, who follow the rules, who simply want to ensure that their government is providing them the fair service to allow them to live their lives, those folks get screwed by these policies. And at times, it's not just an economic consequence. I mean, people are literally losing their lives, as you profiled in your monologue, and those people's lives matter. Sorry if that's politically incorrect to say, but it's true, and I think more folks in government need to be standing up for, I think, consequence in circumstances like this.
I wanted to get your reaction to this. Obviously, the Texas synagogue hostage situation, horrific. And we have so many questions. The investigation is ongoing. But a lot of us are wondering how a man like Malik Akram even made it into this country. And the FBI's original response to it was to suggest that, they don't really know the motive, but, this guy specifically chose a synagogue for a reason, which is pretty despicable. And this same FBI is quick to criticize concerned parents who are going to their school board meetings. They want to label them domestic terrorists. If you're a Trump supporter who did nothing wrong, you're just heading down to the Capitol to have your voice heard on January 6th. They're using all their time and attention going after Trump supporting memas or whatever you want to call it. I mean, you'd think that they'd be more on top of these type of situations. And, we'll give credit where credit's due. FBI and law enforcement handled the situation well once they were there and nobody was hurt. But, I mean, wow, there's just so much going on here. And how do we prevent something like that from happening in the future?
Certainly the tactical activities that resulted in lives being saved should be honored and applauded extensively. And certainly that is how we reflect on those events. But strategically, the FBI has gone totally off the rails, Stephanie. I mean, if they weren't spending so much time trying to label parents who show up at school board meetings terrorists, then they might actually have the bandwidth to stop the real terrorists who pose our fellow Americans harm. The FBI's initial statement was, the motive is undetermined. Well, now, when a radical Islamist shows up at a synagogue with a hostage situation demanding the release of someone who is colloquially termed Lady Al-Qaeda, who literally was planning the murder of U.S. troops abroad, it's pretty easy to determine the motive. In fact, I think it's the FBI's motives that should be called into question when they spend so much time on these frivolous matters that aren't law enforcement matters at all, and then they miss big issues like this. I guess if this Islamic terrorist walked into the synagogue with a noose, they might have gotten more attention than if they walked in with a gun and the threats to kill people in exchange for Lady Al-Qaeda being released.
Yeah, again, my big criticism here is, again, I'm not for jumping to conclusions, but these are all the conclusion jumpers. They're always jumping conclusions on everything else. Like, they can read what's in somebody's heart, yet when somebody does something that's clearly anti-Semitic, they don't want to call it what it is.
Well, and there is a real ongoing threat that exists at Jewish day schools, at synagogues, and as government, we have to be responsive to that threat. We have to protect people when they're in places of worship or in halls of learning, and I think our states and local communities in Florida have prioritized that in our budgeting process, but we shouldn't have federal law enforcement obscuring what's really going on. And when someone shows up at a synagogue saying, I'm going to kill these people unless you release Lady Al-Qaeda, I don't think you have to be Sherlock Holmes to be able to say that there's a pretty easily determinable motive there.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Well, Congressman, we're going to leave it here. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, Stephanie.
Of course.